Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Assistant Professor of International Relations at Webster Vienna Private University, Ralph Schoellhammer. His writing has appeared at the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Unherd, Spiked, Jerusalem Post, many other publications. He's appeared on TV such as Sky News, The Hill, and many other outlets. He's also the host of the 1020 podcast. You want to subscribe to that. Welcome to G&E, Professor Schoellhammer.
Well, thank you so much for having you. I'm a huge fan of your podcast, so this is a very great honor for me to be able to talk to you today.
And you do great work. I mean, I've seen your interviews, your publications at Unherd, interviews you give all over the place. Fantastic work. I think we're very like-minded. And so, I want to get your thoughts on what's happening in the world, globalism, Europe, the world, and we have these global elites, whatever you want to call them, globalists. In the past, they've been referred separately as the trilaterals, Bilderbergers, but they seem now to have come under the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset umbrella. They've got some crazy policies, the climate agenda, deindustrialization, and centralization of power and control. So what's sort of your understanding of who these elites are and what their policies are?
No, I think that is a good description, and to be honest, I also like the term the elites. I know some people, they start to roll their eyes if they hear the elites or the globalists. But I think that is a fair description. There is a group of people, particularly in the Western world, who can afford a certain lifestyle, who don't feel any particular attachment to their place of birth, to traditions, to the way of life and the values that a significant proportion of the population in the West is actually still holding. And I think it is absolutely fair to describe them as globalists or elites or something like that. In fact, just to give you a very quick example of this, I'm a huge fan of the university I'm working at. So it's because they give me a lot of freedom. They allow me to voice my opinions. But even there, if I look at the curriculum, we have a set of mandatory courses for all students, and that set of courses is called, officially, in the catalog, the Global Citizenship Program. So we have it even in the curriculum, right? This idea there is something like a global citizen, that the cosmopolitan who thinks and lives beyond borders and beyond the supposedly outdated modes of thinking of the past. So that's a little bit part of the cultural milieu in which a lot of the leading figures today, both in the media and politics, and of course academia as well, are marinated. And I think this is exactly what we see also unfolding in the current world, because many of their views, I would argue, are now colliding with reality. And I think we have to look at two things, right? One is, what are these policies? And I think we're going to look at that in greater detail in just a second. And the other thing I feel we have to look at is what motivates them. And I think you have wrestled with this idea and discussed about it very interestingly with a lot of fantastic people on your podcast. So I can only repeat what I said before. Everybody who hears this, please subscribe to Geopolitics and Empire and listen to all the other conversations as well, after you listen to this one, of course. But I've wrestled with this question as well, and I came across something, and I'm sure you've heard about this. Many people have heard about it, but not many people have read it. So the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who's very much known for his writing on the business cycle and the idea of creative destruction, he wrote in the 1940s this really interesting book called Socialism, Capitalism, and Democracy. And just to summarize it, he makes this very interesting argument in this book where he says economically capitalism is unbeatable, right? The economic system of capitalism, in the amount of material wealth it produces, cannot be matched by any other system. And I think the empirical evidence bears that argument out. So I think in that way, Schumpeter was right. But Schumpeter says he doesn't think that ultimately kind of the free market or everything we would connect with the capitalist system does survive, because he argues it is so successful, it creates so much wealth that capitalist societies can create a completely new class. So it's not just the working class and the bourgeois. He says there is another class that he calls the intellectual class. And he kind of in a nutshell basically says this intellectual class has two problems. One is they are, I say now these are my words, not Schumpeter's words, they're full of themselves, right? They think they know better than anybody else, but they also feel they never get the recognition or the admiration they deserve. And secondly, they have the problem due to the successes of the capitalist system. They are lacking, I guess, what we would call an existential struggle. The true challenges to overcome are very hard to find, because at least some of the basic human challenges, food, shelter, these kind of things, are more, not perfectly, but are more or less resolved. So the only thing that they have left is to turn against their own civilization, right? Is to turn against their own societies, is to turn against the traditions, the values, the virtues that made the very society in which they live possible. And I think this is a little bit what we see with the globalists and the elites. I think they fall exactly into this category of what Schumpeter was describing, right? It's a group of people that is fantastically wealthy. Many of them are, at least IQ and credential-wise, are very intelligent, very smart people, but their policies reflect exactly this. I mean, they're at war with agriculture. They are at war with, nationalism, with borders. They are at war with, certain traditional way of life. They're at war with the family. So, and these for me are all bits and pieces of this kind of finding an existential struggle via struggling against your own, your own roots, if you want. I know this might sound a little bit exaggerated, but I think it's important to look at this way, because what we then see then is that many fronts in the so-called culture wars, right, whether it's the economic areas, but also it's the gender areas, if it's a question of migration, I think they are part of a bigger picture, because all what you correctly described, all these elitists take the same positions on all these issues, and they see it as part of that, right? For example, after the recent elections in Kenya, when Christiane Amanpour then interviews the newly elected, I think, leader of the victorious party in Kenya, and the first question she asks is about LGBTQ rights in Kenya. That tells you something, regardless of how we stand, what our position on that particular issues. But it tells you the priorities they have. Or to give you another example, I assume many of your listeners probably don't know this, but there were local elections in a German state, in Lower Saxony. And one of the parties, to the great surprise, who actually won about 4 to 5%, was the Green Party. Now, they did two things after this election, which I find so interesting. They polled voters, and the first thing they looked at, what did they mostly care about? And the main motivation, as you can probably guess, for the Green voters was climate change. What else, right? Not energy security, it was climate change. But then they did something else. They looked at the income level of voters. And lo and behold, the group, the party that had the highest share of high income voters was the Green Party. So all these things fit perfectly with what you so accurately described as, elites, and this idea that you have very rich people who kind of have this agenda, primarily, I would argue, for their own, let's say, emotional satisfaction, or what Rob Henderson, a sociologist in the United States, he wrote an entire article, and I think he's currently working on a book with the same title, has called luxury beliefs, right? So in the past, the elites showed their being better by, having a Rolex or driving a Porsche or having a private plane. But now it's also that the virtue signal, certain beliefs. Look, we want to defund the police. We don't believe in gender. All these kind of things. And I think these are all elements of kind of what characterizes those who are part of that elite, because there are rich people who don't see it like that. So being rich alone doesn't make you elite, just as being poor doesn't immediately make you working class. Then I guess we have time to talk about this as well. But I think that's really a big picture here, because what I would argue is that whatever one thinks about this worldview, and everybody can believe whatever they want. I don't care about that much, but I think we have to be honest that beliefs have consequences. Ideas have consequences. And what we see now is that many of the ideas that these people hold are actually, I know I sound a little bit dramatic, but I think it's the only accurate way to describe it, an actual threat to the pillars that uphold whatever we want to call Western civilization. And I think this is one of the reasons why we see it crumbling. And I think this is one of the reasons why we kind of turn out to be so helpless when it comes to many challenges, whether it's geopolitics or energy or, all these other things that are connected to it.
A message from our sponsors. It seems we may be headed for the 1930s all over again. Financial collapse, tyranny, and world war. I've already secured multiple passports, offshore accounts, safe havens, and escaped to the sunnier shores of Mexico. My friend Mikkel Thorup of the Expat Money Show is hosting the Expat Money Summit with 30-plus experts that'll help you reclaim freedom in this fourth turning by moving your life and wealth offshore. Protect yourself and secure a new life abroad. Register now for free at expatmoneysummit.com or don't and enjoy surviving on insect protein while stuck in the metaverse. Since 2020, Ron Unz of Unz.com has argued the COVID outbreak was due to a U.S. biowarfare attack against China and Iran. Jeffrey Sachs, the Russian Ministry of Defense, and others are now making similar suggestions. Weeks before COVID appeared in Wuhan, a top U.S. biowarfare official ran the Crimson Contagion exercise on how to protect America against infection if a dangerous virus suddenly appeared in China. After COVID appeared in Wuhan, it jumped to Iran, infecting Iranian leadership only weeks after America had assassinated Iran's military commander. Iran publicly accused America of an illegal biowarfare attack and filed a complaint with the UN. Ron Unz has produced a free ebook and is available for interviews to further discuss this issue. And don't forget to fund Geopolitics and Empire. You can leave a donation, except on Patreon or PayPal, which have banned us, book a consultation, or become a member. Very well said, and basically, like, they think they're gods. I use that analogy from the Garden of Eden, where the serpent tells Adam and Eve, "You can be like gods." And I think these elites think they're gods, and they're nuts. And as you just laid out, the policies that they're doing are suicidal. And what you mentioned, I studied at the Geneva School of Diplomacy. Right down the street was a branch of your school, Webster University. Some of my professors were from Webster, and indeed, I've had courses literally titled, I had a course, I think it was called Global Governance, and it was taught by a former WTO official. So yeah, I mean, this is the stuff that's taught: world government, global governance, global citizenship. I've taught in the elite schools and high schools in Kazakhstan and Mexico, and the high school students are. It's mandatory for them to do the Model United Nations and UN SDGs and all of these things. And then so you sort of you laid out who these people are, how they think, and maybe some of their agendas. We can see, Europe is the perfect example. The EU, it seems to be committing suicide. They're turning out the lights, sanctions, shooting themselves in the foot, shutting down power, coal, nuclear, gas, instigating this war with Ukraine. I've interviewed folks, as you know, like Michael Jan and others, Thierry Masson, Guy Metton from Switzerland, who say the Ukraine war will collapse Europe and the climate policies will collapse Europe. Famine and freezing are coming. They say, what say you?
No, I think I'm a huge fan of Michael Jan. I know Michael a little bit as well, and I treasure him very much as a friend and an intellectual. I think he, for my taste, sometimes he's a little bit too much on the pessimistic side. I think there is. I think the system is even if it breaks, I think that there will still be, for example, famines in Europe. I find at the moment, but again, I might be too optimistic here, so I can be proven wrong there. But famines in Europe at the moment, I still find somewhat unlikely. I mean, reductions in living standards, no doubt about this, right? Let's say increased prices per calorie, absolutely. So many of the luxuries or the what we were used to in the past is probably going to disappear for the foreseeable future. So that I believe in. But people literally, starving to death in the streets of Paris or the streets of Vienna. I'm a little doubtful. I think it will take a little bit more than the current policies. But my problem both with Terry and Michael, despite my many agreements, is I think they are absolutely right in assessing the symptoms, but we also have to start to address the root cause of it and what we can call the actual illness, if you want. And I think a lot of this can be again kind of traced back to a lack of, again, for lack of a better expression, we have a crisis of cultural confidence in the West. I mean, there is, to go back to the elites that we've talked about, and they are the main driving force behind this, right? Energy policy in Europe was formulated by the elites. I mean, this was not a bottom-up process. The nuclear energy scare, the renewable energy myth that you can power an entire industrialized nation with wind and solar alone. that did not come from a grassroots movement. I mean, this was largely driven from the top down. I mean, even nowadays, if you look at the biographies of whether it's Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion or whatever you want to call them, if you look at these movements, they come from the very well-to-do middle upper class. These are not working class movements. And I think this is something we have to openly say, that we have kind of the pressure from the top, but we have another problem as well. The top is very active, but as you described, which I agree, the elites are very active in this regard. So they set course to drive the car against the wall and over a cliff, basically simultaneously. But they also have kind of tranquilized, for lack of a better term, the working class, the lower class. So this is a little bit the problem, that the assessment that somebody else who I'm absolutely an admirer of is Batya Ungar-Sargon, right? She's the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek. And she really came out, I think, one of the most important voices of the working class in the United States. But the problem is that the working class has also gotten complacent, right? That they a mixture of entertainment and government checks kind of allowed them a little bit to make it comfortable for themselves in somewhat of a forgive me if I use that expression, for somewhat of a meaningless life. It's a little bit of what Alexis de Tocqueville actually described quite nicely. I mean, for those of your listeners and viewers who read de Tocqueville and His Democracy in America, I mean, de Tocqueville describes it almost to the point when he says, what would tyranny in a democracy look like? And this is what he says, right? He says, well, the state is going to enervate. It's not going to be tyrannical in the traditional sense. It's gonna kind of put you in a state of almost sleep. You want to do something, it gets in your way. But it's also going to, it's going to be a tutelage by the states that gives you just enough to want to maintain the system, even though you might know that the system cannot be maintained forever. Best example here is, if you look at the pension system in Europe, I mean, everybody who knows basic math knows that the retirement systems in Europe sooner or later are going to collapse. But nobody wants to do anything about it. And even if governments try to do something about it, people go out on the streets and protest against, retirement at the age of 67 instead of the age of 65. So this is pressure from two sides. So you have the overactive, the overmotivated elites, and then you have the somewhat undermotivated, searching for meaning, spiritually emptied out working class. And I think people like you and I, we are fighting on both fronts here. We have, on the one hand, to point out what's wrong on the top, but at the same time, we also have to try to breathe fresh air in those who are most affected by these policies and who are at the moment are very hard to rise. And it's a little bit, if you think about, it's like an H.G. Wells time machine, right? Where you have the Eloi and the Morlocks, right? You have kind of those who live a life of plenty and enjoyment, and then you have those who labor under dark, so to speak. And I think this is really this is really the problem we have, that we have, and I see this actually as the bigger problem, right? The spiritual emptying, the creation of the robbing of meaning from the life of millions of people, and to tell them, and this is what's happening, to tell them, you don't need family, you don't need community. All you need is, some basic income so that you can buy a new PlayStation and a cheeseburger at McDonald's, and you'll have nothing and you'll be happy. But it's not nothing. It's just enough to keep you quiet. I have to admit, I'm sorry that I'm done with my monologue. I'm almost relieved to a certain extent, and I neither want you nor the listeners to get me wrong. But one thing that happened with COVID, and something you also have talked about with, for example, the Dutch farmers, the farmers in New Zealand. If the elites, if they push too far, you might see signs of life again among those who were complacent in the past, whether it's Dutch farmers, right? Whether it's, the French working class, whether it happens in Italy. So maybe this is the same with COVID. I think COVID showed the people a little bit that even the most supposed benevolent government can turn tyrannical on the, on the turn of a dime. I mean, take, whether it was Australia, New Zealand, countries that 3 years ago we would have called the most liberal, the most tolerant on the planet, kind of switched to tyrannical mode very, very quickly. So maybe and particularly if this fall they want to return to these COVID policies. So maybe they pushed it too far, so that there is a movement saying, you know what, there is more to life than welfare and the government check. That even those who are not rich, even those who are not, I don't know, Instagram influencers with 1 million followers, deserve meaning in their life, and we no longer will allow them to be demeaned, destroyed, ridiculed by, again, quote unquote, the elites, whether it's the church, whether it's the nation, whether it's family, whether it's God. Basically, what Giorgia Meloni said in Italy, or what Mayra Flores, the first Mexican-born Republican congresswoman from Texas, was saying, their principles are 3: it's God, country, family. And the sense that these 3 things under constant attack, maybe this is going to rattle up people again.
No, I think you're nailing it. And as you mentioned, I think, as you said, I think it's a historical fact that it really just takes pain to wake people up. They're not going to see it until they lose their jobs, they're broke, they lose their homes, whatever. It's that cycle. The hard times create, good times create soft men, and then that's where we are. And then the hard times again create strong men. But you mentioned the spiritual emptiness, and I mentioned this often in my podcast because for me it was a powerful moment, and I think it's one of the key issues which you're talking about. I left America in 2006 because I saw this spiritual emptiness. Mm-hmm. I couldn't handle it. Everyone around me, just sports, weather, promiscuity. They're not looking for monogamy or family. And I'm not like, I had enough. It was so empty. I just had to flee. I fled to the Gobi Desert. I found God, became a Christian. But I think that describes, in the Western world especially, the illness that we have. And what do we do in terms of waking people up, or just in general? What have you been thinking about in terms of how do we react now? You described this, the elites, the situation, the lower class. It's like, now what?
Well, I think that the first thing, as always, and I think this is true for you, this is true for me, and I'm sure for most of your listeners as well. I think the first step is to say, is our assessment correct? And if we look, because people can say, how do I pronounce your first name? You need to help me here.
Hervoye.
Okay, Javier and Ralph, right? I mean, they just pulled this all out of thin air. So is there any truth to what they're saying? And I think if we look at, for example, Jonathan Haidt, I mean, if your listeners don't know him, I highly recommend that they check out his work. He's a psychologist, a social psychologist at the Stern School of Business at NYU. He wrote a fantastic book called The Righteous Mind. So I really highly recommend it. And he's also an extremely nice person. And he has also written another book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And basically, and he's a liberal, right? He advised, I think, John Kerry during his 2004 campaign. So this is not a man you would say who's a right winger or anything. But he says we really have a problem, particularly also with the younger generation, which is less happy, less resilient, much more fragile. So they are like, we're not raising a generation of go-getters, happy, life-enjoying young people. It's the opposite. Joseph Henrichs, I think he's a Harvard psychologist. He wrote another great book about what he calls weird people, and weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And he comes to a similar assessment, right? But he says that there is something going on there. And the recent study did it recently said the same. We are less happy than we were 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. I mean, you described just a second ago how you found to God, how you found religion. I mean, I have a very good sense that probably since that moment, you have been a much happier person than you have been before. And the question, I cannot tell you whether God exists or not, but I can tell you that having faith that's an anchor in your life. That's a pole for moral values, right? It puts a yardstick or a red line into the sand that doesn't need justification, and that is a good thing, right? Certain moral values shouldn't be up for questioning. There are things, as I guess my grandmother would say, right? When you say, why is it like that? And the answer is because that's just how it is. What you said, to give you one example, this is something they use in these psychological studies. if we reduce society, what is currently happening, to liberal individual autonomy, and the only value that matters is consent, right? The only thing that matters is whether it's good for me, but it doesn't matter for the rest of society. I mean, I'd be completely honest with you. Okay, then let's abolish laws against incest, right? Let's abolish laws against pedophilia, against polygamy, all these kind of things. Because if consent is the only thing that matters, if we have, and I don't mean to go on a rant, but we need to look at this honestly. If we say a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old, a 12-year-old can decide to go on puberty blockers, have their breasts removed, or have their genitals removed, or kind of basically what I would call a form of mutilation done to them, well, then why exactly would you not allow an 11 or 12-year-old to be in a sexual relationship with a close relative if they supposedly consent to it? Now, people will say, oh my God, this is extreme. Well, is it? A lot of the things we see nowadays probably seemed extreme 10, 15 years ago. And of course, the same is true when, and I think this is, and I don't mean to get off topic. I always want to bring it to the one point. This is part of a larger phenomenon. So the same people that tell you we do not know what a woman is, to use the now famous circulating question, are the same people who tell you, oh, we don't need fossil fuels. All you need is a wind turbine and a few solar cells on your roof, and you're basically covered for the rest of your life. And both of these things are wrong, but they come from the same source. They come from, again, for lack of a better term, what I call it's a coordinated or willful attack on reason, on logic, on morality, on values, but not because those values are wrong, not because that morality is wrong. My belief is, and that's what I'm convinced of, it's because those on top, I'm exaggerating here, but at the core I mean it, they are bored. They are bored out of their mind. And so what is it that they do? So they need some struggle. This is, funnily enough, actually the thing that in his book, The End of History, Fukuyama writes in the second half of the book, he explicitly says, a system that is the successful liberal democracy will create a class of bored people. And if we cannot control their desire for struggle, they will start to struggle against that very system. And I think this is what we are seeing. And I wouldn't care about this if they would keep it to themselves, right? If Elon Musk has 5 children or 600 children with 50 different wives or women or whatever it is, I don't care, because he can afford it. But if these things bled through to the lower socioeconomic classes, they might then attempt to live that lifestyle, but they cannot afford it. They don't have the resources to do it. And then what you get, I think, is psychological problems, degraded communities, weakening bonds of between individuals, or as to put a more academic term on it, you lose social capital. You lose trust within society, and everything gets more difficult. And this is what we see now. If people only identify with themselves, if there is no longer a sense of community, a shared identity, then life becomes, it grinds to a halt, if you want. And then the solution for many on the liberal, but increasingly also for some on the right, is to say, oh, the state is going to jump in. The state can do it. The state cannot replace the bonds of community or the voluntary bonds of community. And we mocked this for years. We mocked the church. We mocked the bowling leagues. We mocked basically everything that gave meaning to the life of the working and the lower classes. And now these things are disappearing. And the pile of human wreckage is getting higher and higher and higher every year. So if we do not do anything about this, we're going to have a huge problem. And what we would have to do is having the elites encouraging a life of meaning, even if that means, I don't know, Chris Pratt, right? So, I mean, there are Hollywood stars or people who kind of, who I think try to at least in their own lives, kind of are exemplary. And without that, I think we're going to have a problem. Well, if this is a conservative viewpoint, so be it, then call me a conservative. But this is really my biggest issue, that the cultural underpinnings, or we have taken a sledgehammer to the cultural underpinnings of our civilization. And I don't know if once the dust has settled and we stand knee deep in the rubble, if what we're going to see is something we're going to like very much.
Yeah, in the Christian world, they say, where the churches go, the rest of the nation goes. So it's kind of what you were saying, where if the churches weren't, and the people in those churches were not doing their jobs, maintaining this, moral vision, then we're screwed. The government, as you just explained, is just things are just going to get worse. And I think I'm making an objective observation. You pointed out that trend. If you see, we had traditional marriage. If you go to many of the countries I've lived in, like Kazakhstan and Mongolia, 95% just view marriage as man and woman. That's it. And so in the West, we got same-sex marriage, and now you've got the whole transgender stuff. A boy can be a girl. They're trying to normalize pedophilia now. I've seen reports in different parts of the world of bestiality now they want to normalize. New York Times is talking about cannibalism. I mean, you can
yes, I read that. Yeah,
you can see this trend, exactly what you're saying, and there's no end to it, and it's suicide. The end is just total annihilation of humanity, and just the final thought on the cultural stuff you were talking about. All of this is anti-human. It seems to be an inversion, a perversion. Putin called it satanic. This cultural war, this wokeism, attack on religion, tradition, family, logic. I actually had that in my question. You mentioned it. Do you see a peak to any of this insanity? I mean, you just said we don't know how it's going to end up, but any further thought on this cultural aspect?
Well, I think that the peak is going to come, and this is what I'm afraid of. I think that the peak is going to come in the form of poverty. There is, I believe, a huge misconception, especially on part of many of the world's leading economists, and I hope they forgive me if I say this. There is still this idea that what's currently happening is just going to be another regular business cycle. We go through a recession, and then after the recession, the economy is going to expand again, and there will remain a positive trajectory of growth. But what we see currently happening, and you mentioned this before, the fundamentals of European economies are withering away. For example, if Germany is deindustrializing, I don't see who is going to drag them out of stagflation. But the assumption is simply, it's going to happen. Well, is it? If the Mittelstand, right, the famous middle class, the small and medium enterprises who have been the backbone of the German economy, if they disappear, either they move to other countries where they can afford the energy, or they close down. So who is going to drag Germany out of this misery? And my fear is that's what the other thing that I said about the elections in Lower Saxony. But people either stop voting. I mean, that's one thing. The largest party was actually the party of non-voters. But those who vote is still 25 to 30% for the Green Party. So at some point, and I love the Germans, don't get me wrong, but if you vote for your own suicide, well, at some point you have to accept the results. So this is, I think, one of the advantages still of liberal democracy. We can actually call it a form of suicide, right? Because we can literally say, because they make no qualms out of it, right? They tell us what the program is. And if people still go to the voting booth and vote for them, at some point, I can only say, listen, if this is the choice you made, I don't know what to tell you. And I think this is the problem, because they still believe, so many people, I think, still believe in this normalcy bias, that things have been a certain way, let's say, since the 90s, and they're going to continue like this, and now this is just a hiccup. I don't think what currently happens is just a hiccup. I think this is now, make or break for Europe. I'm not worried so much about the United States. The United States, for whatever reason, there are some of them, they have many sources of internal renewal. But in Europe, at least in Western Europe, I'm worried that the descent is going to continue. And at some point, it's too late to stop it, right? You can, I think now you could still arrest it. But at some point, if those industries are gone, they take innovation with them. They take, training of the new workforce with them. They take everything you need for a healthy society / economy with them. And the government cannot simply rebuild this. This is an illusion. The idea that the government can simply replace everything you lose in the non-governmental sector is, first of all, it's totalitarian, but it's also not working. We see this now because the only thing the government apparently can do, with some exceptions, is throw money at stuff. But in Europe, that money is rapidly losing value. We were told 10, 20 years ago how the euro is going to replace the dollar, and the Americans better prepare because now there is a new power in town, and the euro will crush the dollar. No, it's not. If anything crushes anything, the dollar crushes every other currency. And this is my fear. It's not too late, but every time we get election results, my sense is, the problem is that as we back to what we said before, those who probably share our thinking have simply turned their back on the political system, and those on the other side are increasingly controlling the political system because they participate in it. They participate in the media. They participate in culture. People who think like you and I, but both of us are probably too young, so this is also true for a generation before us. We forgot we never fought the culture wars. Let's put it this way. We talked a lot about them, but we never actually fought them. And I think this is now why we get why we are in the kind of trouble that we are in.
Speaking of Europe, the good news is once you hit rock bottom, the only way direction is up. And I've got, from artofmanliness.com right in front of me here, Rudyard Kipling's poem where he says, what do you say? If you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it all on one turn of pitch and toss and lose and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss. I guess that's the attitude we have to have going forward. If things do crash, it's not necessarily the end of the world, but it's going to be hard times. But as you said, we're committing this to suicide.
Yeah.
So.
Let me say two things about this. This is true, I think, to some extent. And if you look at the history of Western civilization, it has been a civilization that kind of went through renewal several times. We have an entire period we call the Renaissance, right? So there is this renewal, but there are times when civilizations truly do disappear. Whether it was through external factors like the Aztecs or the Mayas or the Incas, or whether it was because they simply got too weak, like the Egyptians versus the Romans, or for a long time, I guess this is how justifiably so, but this is how the Chinese felt. So the idea, I hope you're right and I'm wrong, but I think you reach a point where people are going to survive, right? There will be people in Europe, but there is no guarantee that, and this is, I think, what many people still believe will be the case, that we will still live the life we live today, that we buy our cheap electronic trinkets made in China. Because I'm very serious here, look at those trinkets. 20 years ago, you could buy a cell phone made by the Swedish company Ericsson, or the Finnish company Nokia, or the German company Siemens. Those days are gone. Pretty much the entire cell phone industry is now based in China, South Korea, a little bit Taiwan, and the United States. What TVs do people have? It's Toshiba's, it's LG's, it's all these kind of things. Personal computers. So all these, where are the social media companies that so many of us use? What are the big new things? Amazon, Alibaba. So Europe has lost pretty much connection to all the new things that came up in the last 30 years. We still have some of our old traditional companies, but even they are getting into trouble, right? You cannot be a manufacturing superpower if your energy is so expensive that you have to turn off your, aluminum factories and your steel furnaces. So, my thing, I don't know how you come back from this. I know how you would, right? You build nuclear, you start fracking, you do all the things, but they still don't want to do this. And at some point, the markets, this is, I think, a little bit the advantage now. The markets still look at Europe the way that you and I do, right? I think they say, well, they're going to dig themselves out of this problem sooner or later. But at one point, they're going to look at this and say, what underlying fundamentals are there to believe that Europe will start to grow again? And somebody will be the first. Will it be a huge hedge fund? Will it be a huge institutional investor? Somebody will pull the plug and say, we go out of Europe because we don't think that so we no longer, let's say, go long on Europe. We think that they don't have the necessary conditions for sustainable future growth, and then others will follow along. Then European pension funds will start to crash, and then all of a sudden the entire system will turn upside down, and everybody is going to say, We didn't see that coming. How was this possible? Well, it's already happening partially. And I'm very worried that we kick the can down the road, but I think we're running very short of road very, very soon.
You mentioned my fellow Mexican and fellow American Mayra Flores in Texas. You also mentioned Georgia Meloni. We saw in Sweden a right party now come to power, and you wrote on Unherd, I think a month ago, you wrote about Germans turning against Olaf Scholz. What does all of this portend? You know, for example, someone like Meloni, I see the danger that we see these sort of anti-establishment populists come to power, but then they often get absorbed by the status quo. Do you think some of these people might be able to actually make any positive changes?
I hope, but I don't believe it. And the reason why I don't believe it is because even they, despite their temporary successes, are not willing to really talk about the problem. They talk about one side of the problem, justifiably and correctly so, right? They talk about the elites, they talk about the establishment, but they don't touch on the other side, right? They don't have the guts, unfortunately, to say, but listen, guys, we have a problem with those on top, but we also have a problem with you on the bottom. And what this means is the age of the welfare state in its current form has come to an end. It's not sustainable. It's sustainable maybe for one more generation or two more generations, but then the system is going to crash. I think that as nice as it sounds, and this always gets me lots of critiques, I'm not against the poor. On the contrary, I care a lot about the poor. But I think that we made poverty into a state of mind. What we talked about before, right? That we turned it into a psychological, spiritual problem, and the welfare state plays a role in this. We need to reform the welfare state in such a way that it supports people, but not just financially, but that it supports people in finding meaning and purpose in life. There should be no option for anyone to simply choose not to work. A life without work is a life without meaning. Unless, again, if you have sicknesses, if you are taking care of children. So, but those are all meaningful things. If you are, I don't know, if you have a serious illness, that is enough meaning in your life because you're probably going to struggle against that illness for the rest of your life. And of course, I want the government to help. I want the government to help children, right? Children who, let's say, are sick. I think there should be no limit financially to help, children who suffer from whether it's cancer or something else. But I also believe that adults should take care, for example, of their own health insurance. The only thing the government should do is say, listen, buddy, you have now reached an age where it might be smart to get insurance. Self-reliance, responsibility are virtues that are necessary. And I think neither Meloni nor other right-wingers have the balls, I mean, that might be the wrong term, but have the courage to say that, because even Meloni got into office and was immediately talking about how they're going to expand the welfare state and how they're going to expand social services. If you do this in 3 or 4 generations, there will be no Italians left. And any policy, you cannot describe a policy as nationalist or God, country, family based if its consequences are less of your people. Let's put it this way, right? So they need to see this as well. It's not enough to be against migration. It's important. It's not enough to criticize, the global elites. It's important. It's not enough. There is a problem in the working class, in the lower classes, in the middle class as well. Not addressing that elephant in the room will make all these victories meaningless. So my proposal, and I'm actually playing with this idea, to found a party and call it the one-time party. What the program basically is saying, vote us into office. We make all the necessary reforms. You're going to hate us after 5 years and vote us out. But once we have put all these things in place, hopefully enough of them will remain to kind of keep the thing going. But that's the problem. Nobody wants to touch on the uncomfortable things because they're afraid of losing elections. However, last point on this, I think people intuitively understand it. I think people know that it can't go on like this. But as long as somebody tells them, no, don't worry, it's not a problem, we got it figured out, they say, well, if they say so, don't they know better? I think they would go for a candidate who says, this is not working, like there will be pain, but that pain, of course, also important, that pain must be distributed, right? It cannot be that only then again, those who don't have much are bearing the brunt of the negative consequences. But something is gonna give at some point, and I think we're still terrified of saying that. And the European model of staying in education until you're 30, then work until you are 65, and then be in retirement until 85. So that's basically 50 years out of 85 years where you're not in, let's say, a productive stage of your life, and where you are a drag on let's say on public funds. That is not sustainable. We can quibble about the details, but overall, the current European model is not sustainable, and nobody, even those right wingers, I think, dares to address this.
Yeah, all good points. I forgot to mention when you were talking earlier about the collapse of civilization and empire. I saw you did a podcast with a high level guest on the collapse of the Roman Empire,
Yes.
and I'm going to go back and watch that and probably get that book. I mean, again, I think your podcast is underrated, and people should check that out as well. And just a thought on the EU. Myself, as a Croatian citizen, an unwitting EU citizen, to be frank, I'm just not a fan of the EU. I hope it collapses. What's your feel about Brussels?
I think it might drag on for a while, but I think that collapse is going to come sooner or later for two reasons. One is that they have been taken over. You see it in pretty much every speech by Ursula von der Leyen. I think they have been almost entirely taken over by the green boondoggle and this again, completely insane ideas in the field of energy. But the second thing is there is a rift in the way how Western Europe and Eastern Europe perceives the shared European project. I think in Western Europe, the famous Berlin-Paris axis, they see the European future differently, let's say, than the Eastern European part. The Poles, the Hungarians, the Czechs, and those. And I don't believe that those two competing visions can be kept within one political body. And the Ukraine war, in many ways, I think will serve as an accelerator of that development. The nation state, at least in Eastern Europe, is coming back, and I think the idea, as beautiful as it was in theory, I'm not opposed to it. But I think the supranational state, this idea, right? You have this institution that ultimately are more important or have more authority and legitimacy than traditional nation states. I think that is going to come to an end. I mean, I will say one more thing, just real quick, because that's something I also find at least interesting. With everything that goes on in Ukraine, and I know you had very interesting guests on this topic as well, but the only thing that strikes me also as quite significant is this war is going to end at some point, in one way or another. But when I look at the cultural conditions, matters of identity, matters of kind of dedication to one's country, to one's traditions, I'm not sure if, for example, a country like Ukraine in many ways isn't healthier than, let's say, certain parts of the United States or certain parts or certain areas of the population in Germany, Austria, or otherwise. And I think this is one of the, just as a personal opinion, I think one of the reasons why the very elites we talked about, who kind of disdain nationalism and patriotism and borders at every turn, and like wherever they could, are now exactly the ones talking about we need to deliver more weapons and more support for Ukraine, and to put little Ukrainian flags in their social media profile. It shows you their spiritual emptiness, right? They finally found a nationalism they can sign on to. And are they excited about it, right? Finally, right? It's finally they can feel good about yelling. They cannot bring themselves to say Vive la France or Long Live Germany. But Slava Ukraini, that's not a problem. This is not about Ukraine for them, even though they claim. This is about themselves. It's exactly what we talked at the beginning of our conversation. It's part of that spiritual emptiness. So maybe they discover Ukrainian nationalism. They're willing to give in a little bit in the energy and economic areas. So maybe that then also will turn out to save Europe. At the moment, I don't believe it. But this is all part. So even the way elites react to the war in Ukraine, in my opinion, is part of the thing that we discussed at the beginning. And you saw this today. There was an article in the Washington Post. The US government has no plan how to act in this conflict. I mean, this is astounding, whatever your position on this might be. But not to have a plan is so everything they do is just reacting. But I think it's the same thing, because there is an element about making them feel good about themselves. Again, I generally think that redrawing borders in Europe is a bad idea. So I'd rather have borders return to what they were in 2014 or 1991. I leave that where it is. But it's very odd that this is not driven by a plan, by a strategy, by here is what we want you to accomplish, but simply by we feel the moral obligation. And the thing about international politics is I consider myself in many ways a moral person, as I'm sure you do as well. But you cannot base politics and state relations solely on morality, right? There are national interests. And if you can not even formulate them, you just prolong a catastrophe and potentially make it worse. And we do see this a little bit in Ukraine again. I mean, I don't think it's entirely unrealistic to say, I'm more optimistic about it not happening. But the trajectory is one where at least the potential for nuclear war has increased. And I mean, that's not a good thing to happen.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I never thought about that. You pointed out the irony in how the globalists, the supranationalists are supporting nationalism in Ukraine when it serves them. And any other thoughts, final thoughts, preparing for difficult times or anything else?
Well, the only advice I always have to people who look at the world as we do, and I do think that we are correct in most of these issues, is not to despair, not to lose hope, and not lose our good spirits. There's one thing that I always find is the best weapon you have against these elite establishment globalist driven agenda. They are utterly humorless. They are utterly humorless. And this is for me that the strongest weapon I think we have potentially in this conflict is to maintain a happy demeanor, to point out the ridiculousness, to point out the utter insanity of many of the things they are claiming. I think we can get many people onto the right side or realize the proportion of the problem if you engage with the other side, but do it somewhat also in a jokingly way, right? Kind of nothing. I forgot who said it. I think it was Chesterton. That nothing can withstand the assault of laughter. And there are things that are utterly ridiculous. And I think they must be pointed out as such, because it means we take them serious enough to talk about them. But one thing should also say it's insanity, right? Whether it's from the gender area to the energy area, some things are just pure, like the German suggestion as they had a while, right? That you want to replace all the cars with bicycles. I mean, it kind of is funny, right? It's so ridiculous, it's almost funny. And I think this is, or the idea that you make solar farms in, the Northern Hemisphere where they have, 40% sun per year, slightly more, of course, but when they have entire periods where there's barely any sun. I mean, I think one just has to point out the ridiculousness of these things, and that it is funny. And I think that's kind of always my advice, to see the fun in it. And the second one, and I know that you do this fantastically with your podcast, we need to learn history again. We have become historical illiterates, and I think a consequence of this is an incredible arrogance of the present. Particularly, I have to admit, sometimes among the younger generation, right? There is this idea that they know best, and therefore they don't even have to engage with ideas of the past. I think is very dangerous, because if we take a look at history, many of the problems, many of the ideas, both the good ones and the insane ones, they have been there before. Just this one quick example. If you look at the French intellectuals before the French Revolution, so from polygamy to, gender confusion, these kind of things, it's all been there because they were in the same position. They were people very smart, very rich, very well off, beyond any existential struggle. So they had some good ideas as well, don't get me wrong, but this is also why they came up with a lot of crazy stuff, because they were in the same position as elites today. And this is what I always say, right? The purpose of let's say, a conservative movement, if you want to call this, is to articulate the things that the common person feels intuitively. And I think most people intuitively feel from all these areas we discussed that they cannot go on like this. And it's the purpose of people like you, like me, and others who are part of this conversation to kind of create this intellectual movement that is not condescending to the common people, but gives them a voice. And I think that's, it's going to be a long struggle. But as I always say, if we lose, we can say, we told you so. And if we win and prevent the apocalypse, we can always tell ourselves we might not get a lot of gratitude for it, but it's still nice to know that we contributed our part to maintaining one of the historically, I think, greatest civilizations there has ever been.
As you say, if we win, we won't have to become cannibals, according to the New York Times. And on
precisely,
and on your 2 points, the elites are humorless. I totally agree. I was in Geneva. I spent time around these people. Not only are they humorless, the ones that do attempt it, they're absolutely they're bad at humor. They're not even funny. And also the point on history, like my recent experience, because I was in Kazakhstan, which was part of the former Soviet Union, and in Croatia recently, meeting some young Ukrainians, and Ukraine, part of the former Soviet Union. And 5 years ago, I met Gorbachev, and I was just for fun, because there were people, they were part of the former Soviet Union, so I would show this 20-year-old Ukrainian a photo. Oh, look, I shook hands with the last president of the Soviet Union, and they're like, I showed the picture, and she's like, who's that? And I've showed young generation Kazakhs photo of that, and they're like, who's that? And it would be like me not knowing who is Tito in Yugoslavia, myself as a pro.
That's a very good comparison.
It's unbelievable. The youth today I can't believe they don't know who Gorbachev was. That's their history. That's their recent history, just a couple decades ago. Anyways, could you tell us about your podcast projects and where best to find you?
I think the best way to find me is to just Google my name. It takes you usually directly to my homepage, where you can find links to all my writings, to my podcast, and to all the things that I do. It's a very old-fashioned homepage, I have to warn your listeners. I started it, I think, like 12 years ago, and it still has. I mean, everything's on there. So if you like scrolling, and so you'll find everything. Twitter is a good source. It's a horrible platform, but it has its moments. And but usually just Googling, I think just my name will take you right there. And as always, just like you do, right, everything that I do, provided is free. So there is no, I'm not their highest risk is to subscribe, to be getting a notification if there is a new podcast, or if there is new content, but there is never any fees or anything connected to that.
Yeah, I don't charge for the podcast. I put 1 minute and a half ad. So hopefully, I mean, everyone else does it. Joe Rogan, Alex Jones. So it's not too hard to ask for people to sit through a minute ad for free.
Agreed.
Content that helps me keep doing what I'm doing, and gives me money to buy tacos to survive.
Yes. And it's as you say, right? I mean, this is a very small price to pay for somebody who enjoys all the hard work that you're doing.
Yeah, and I'll include all of your Ralph's links in the description. Follow him, subscribe to his awesome podcast, and again, really original stuff we heard from you today. And thank you for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. I hope we can do it again.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem, SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissident Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.